the global trade relationship has seen many African countries confronted with trade deficits, a problem that is most likely to be exacerbated under the African Common Free Trade Area if it is not well addressed. The weak tax policies and regimes that have undermined domestic resource mobilization and increased the appetite for our African governments for debt. The average cost of food has risen to at least 10% across the continent as incomes have fallen even by bigger margin. And this trend is likely to see millions of Africans fall into extreme poverty. At the global level, we continue to see a consolidation and concentration of power in the hands of few international institutions that are controlled by wealthy countries and that have relegated themselves the power to set global rules. The global tax governance, for instance, continues to be under the armpit of the OECD, which operates and dominates the rule setting. The same applies across the different economic spheres. So while the rhetoric of international development speaks of leaving no one behind, the reality is that African countries have been left behind and have to contend with their own challenges, some that are not even in their own making. And what does that mean then in the context of this meeting? A key lesson to draw is that we cannot afford to rely on the largesse and the generosity of rich countries. We must, as a matter of fact, and as a matter of agency, lay down strategies to grow our domestic capacity, specifically on domestic resource mobilization, which is the central theme of this conference. Reforms on domestic fiscal policies that seek to broaden the revenue base, investment in measures to increase state and institutional capacity, including administrative capacities, an overhaul and updates of legislation that reflect the dynamic and changing economic paradigms, such as the digitalization we see across the continent, a review of tax incentive regimes, and the harmonization of fiscal policies to address the harmful tax competition and race to the bottom. And lastly, a demand or a push for the overhaul of the global governance architecture to ensure that the interests of Africans are catered for. It is this context that I hope that in the next 2 days, colleagues, we'll have an opportunity to reflect and debate some of these proposals and work towards a shared understanding that fits our shared pursuit for a transformed Africa as espoused in the Agenda 2063. We have, in the context of this conference, provided a multifaceted program, and in a way we hope that it provides opportunity for rich dialogue, both in the plenary and in the breakaway groups. The conference offers, or the program offers 9 separate breakout sessions that have been independently organized and offer a wide spectrum of issues relevant to the conference theme. And I would like in this context to, in a special way, to thank our co-convening organizations that have helped co-create the program and make it as exciting as it is. I would like to acknowledge the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the Southern Africa Resource Watch, UNDP, Third World Network, NAWI AfriFem, UNCTAD, AfroDad, Transparency International, the Stop the Bleeding campaign, ActionAid for Equality, and Ataglo are some of the key conveners that have put together this program. Having 12 organizations co-convene the Third Pan-Africa Conference really reflects the founding spirit and the vision of the conference, which is to create a space to deepen collaboration among civil society organizations, international organizations, government agencies, academia, and opinion shapers. A space that allows deeper reflection on emerging issues on tackling illicit financial flows and taking stock of the progress that we are making. And finally, a space to reshape our thinking for the next decade as we orient our interventions going forward. I hope that the 10th Pan-Africa Conference will deliver on this ambitious endeavor. And once again, thank you very much for making time to participate. I acknowledge that we have an even bigger group of participants online. And with that, I would like to welcome you all and look forward to engaging all of you in the 10th Pan-Africa Conference. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. The Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance and National Planning, Mr. Trevor Kaunda, Alvin Musioma, the Executive Director, Tax Justice Network Africa, Mr. Isaac Mondea, Center for Trade and Policy, distinguished and honorable members of Parliament, heads of African civil society organizations, ALTAF and TJNA members, ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by adding my voice to Alvin's to say that it is really a pleasure for ALTAF to be co-hosting this event with TJNA and all the other very good co-conveners who have over the years walked this journey as we try to work towards fighting illicit financial flows and improve domestic resource mobilization in a quest to develop Africa. So I'd like to observe all protocol and to say that I was particularly moved by the choir. It was such a lovely way to start this meeting. I thought I had to mention it before I go on. TJNA has been well ahead of the curve in the debate on IFFs, and ATAF is proud to partner with TJNA. I'm not saying that because we are partnering on this, but it's because we've worked together along the way. TJNA is able to do a lot of what we can't do, and that is speak. So we really appreciate this, and as we appreciate all the other partners. While we celebrate the 10th Pan-African Conference on IFFs, it is important to take stock of where we are in this fight in a global economy largely in recovery, and with the ongoing debate on the global tax system and the ever-increasing volume of illicit financial flows. As ATAF, we view the overall objective here as being the fight against IFFs through advocacy and through innovative policies, tools, and technical support to the different countries so that they can get to this objective. In a nutshell, I'm saying that for us, the way we see this and the objective and the hope from this meeting is that we will move to a practical manner in which we address these IFFs and sort of like reduce on the lip service. Because I think we've gone over that over years, and I was so pleased to see and to hear the debate that was going on, especially by the parliamentarians, and how they were addressing some of those issues. I am looking at somebody who was quite vocal, so it's really appreciated. Dear participants, the need to mobilize domestic resources has intensified, like Alvin said, and I will not belabor the point. I'll just say a few things, especially in Africa, based on its stuttering economic growth. The recent revisions of Africa's economic growth by the World Bank from 5% to 3.2% paint a picture that necessitates an increased pace in implementing the various recommendations on fighting illicit financial flows and adapting policy options that support this. And I'm so glad to see my brother here from the African Union who have taken a very strong lead in this policy direction, and we are truly appreciative to be partnering with you. Additionally, the various crises that Alvin talked about have exacerbated the debt issues facing African countries. According to the African Tax Outlook, which is a native publication, 15 African countries illustrate that government debt outpaced tax revenue. Similarly, the debt to GDP ratios also outpaced the tax to GDP ratios. Moreover, the IMF notes that public debt in sub-Saharan Africa has a weighted average of 58% of GDP. In value comparison, Sub-Saharan debt in 2010 stood at $305 billion and rose to 700 in 2020. This represents the highest levels of debt in 15 years, and the growing debt owes largely to declining revenues and output. So needless to say, it isn't sustainable. And as concerned actors, this, if nothing else, should galvanize us all into action to salvage Africa. But enough of the bleak picture and the moaning and groaning, and I would advance to what we as ATAP think we can do. So the theme of the conference is really apt in our opinion. So there has to be a rethink on how we attain Africa's self-sustainability. The discussion over the 2 days, we hope, should focus on practical solutions, ways to coordinate, and policy options to attain this. So distinguished dear colleagues, as a key actor in this fight on IFFs, please oblige me and allow me to share ATAP's 2 pence in what we consider solutions to IFF steadily, to fighting IFF steadily until we get to a level where our revenues will be protected and our countries notice a difference in their coffers. And some of what we have been able to do in the short and long term, short and medium term, we have been able to support countries to build capacity to protect this revenue. And to date, we are at least in 24 countries where we are addressing issues to do with transfer pricing, exchange of information, name it, to try and help countries to protect their revenue. We have also recently established what we call the Rapid Response Unit, because during the COVID-19 period, countries kept talking about the fact that they were not able to conclude some of the audits due to their complexity. And because of this and many other issues, we have been supporting the countries to try and conclude this so that they can attain these low-hanging fruits. And with that, we think it has been helpful, and we hope that it will continue to be an area that countries can really target. So as we go on, I want to say that one of the areas we have focused in is tax transparency, and under the leadership of the AU, once again, we have come up with different areas of focus as detailed by the Ministers of Finance of the AU, and this is what is going to be really our direction, our compass, so to speak, as we try to continue fighting these illicit financial flows. And this partnership with the AUC, with TJNA, and all the other players is what we consider as a key way to move forward and a key way to address these illicit financial flows. And we are hoping that in the next 2 days, we will be able to actually delve into some of these issues and be able to come up with recommendations that are really fit for purpose for Africa, given the fact that there is really not much that is coming out of the reforms. And we had all been waiting and waiting, with our breath held. But to date, we all know that the outcome is really not what we thought it was. And because of that, we will have to work a little harder, even as we continue advocating. So thank you so much for your kind attention. And I wish you all good deliberations over the next 2 days. And may God truly bless you.
Right. Good morning, everybody. Seeing that part of what we're doing here is exchanging information, we saw our lovely children sing the national anthem in English and in various local languages. I'd like to invite us to also greet each other in our local languages. I took note that including Zambia, we have 21 countries represented here. So perhaps Burundi, your greetings, how do you say your good morning in the indigenous language? Burundi, where you are? Yes. Okay. Rwanda. Yes. Uh-huh. Sierra Leone, You can use the mic. Okay. Zambia, one of the indigenous languages. Zambia. Zimbabwe. Uganda. Brazil. Yes, Brazil, the greeting. Okay. Tanzania. South Africa. See? There we go. Angola. Nigeria. Kenya. Eswatini. Ethiopia. Okay. Cameroon. Malawi. Italy. Namibia. Ghana. Senegal. Egypt. Okay. Is there any other country that came in later that has not been taken note of? Who would like to greet us in their local? Yes, yes, madam. And the greeting? All right. Anyone else? Yes, sir. Okay. So thank you very much. Oh, yes, there's another hand. Yes, sir. You can greet us again, sir. No problem. What's the greeting? Okay. Yes, sir. Okay. Any other? We went through all those. So the organizers, is it then possible that at the end of the 2-day period, you could say your goodbyes in these languages you could learn and as you network? Yeah. All right. So anyway, as I begin my address, let me acknowledge the presence of the board chairperson for the Center of Trade Policy and Development, the Deputy Executive Secretary for the Africa Tax Administration Forum, the Executive Director, Tax Justice Network Africa, the distinguished honorable members of Parliament who would be present here, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. I am here rendering a speech on behalf of the Minister of Finance and National Planning Zambia, Honorable Stumbeko Msokotwane, who would have loved to be here because the invitation was sent to his office, but because of other equally important national assignments, he has not been able to be with us this morning, so he had requested that I come over and deliver the speech on his behalf. And as I have been introduced, my name is Trevor Kaunda. I'm a permanent secretary, or one of the permanent secretaries in the Ministry of Finance and National Planning Zambia, and I am responsible for monitoring and evaluation. Usually in a meeting such as this, when people hear my surname, that magical question always comes up. Are you related to KK? Unfortunately not. It's just a coincidence of names, and unfortunately he's no longer with us, so I don't have permission to pretend that we were related. So here is the minister's speech. I am pleased to address the 10th Pan-African Conference on Illicit Financial Flows and Taxation, which is focused on actualizing tax justice in the midst of multiple crises. According to the African Economic Outlook of 2022, real GDP in Africa recovered strongly in 2021, growing by 6.9%. This was mainly driven by recovery in global demand, higher oil prices that benefited oil exporting countries, easing of the COVID-19 restrictions in most countries, and associated growth in domestic consumption and investment. Notwithstanding the overall improvement in macroeconomic fundamentals, significant challenges still remain. And these challenges are largely due to the persistence of the COVID-19 effects, the dampening of global demand induced by the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the extreme weather conditions that have been occasioned by climate change-related disasters that we have recorded on the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear to note that the three-pronged crises have complicated the continent's desire to achieve quality and social justice through fair taxes, among others. While illicit flows are difficult to quantify, given their underlying sources and nature, there is a general acknowledgement that they are significant and growing, especially in resource-rich countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the three-pronged crises that I have alluded to have proven the urgent need for Africa to look inwards to ensure sustainable and inclusive financing of public services. To this end, the view is that domestic resource mobilization through taxation is the most sustainable source of financing development in Africa. I am pleased to inform you that in Zambia, the government, through the Zambia Revenue Authority, has put in place a number of strategies to curb illicit financial flows and enhance domestic revenue mobilization. And these efforts include, 1, the setting up of a dedicated investigations unit that targets countering tax evasion practices and prosecuting such offenses. In 2021, 700 tax evasion cases were prosecuted. 2, setting up of an enforcement unit whose mandate is to execute anti-smuggling initiatives. In 2021, 2,452 interceptions with a value of our local currency, Zambian kwacha, 140 million were recorded, and this is approximately, is it about $9 million or so? Then thirdly, establishment of a transfer pricing unit which is responsible for conducting specialized audits that can detect transfer pricing practices among multinational companies. And the Zambia Revenue Authority has also partnered with the OECD, the UN, the ATAF, the IBFD in this regard. And here I must say the conference organizers that being new to this sector, I've seen some acronyms, and not too long ago, is it about a month ago, I was sent to Livingstone to grace the occasion for the anti-money laundering conference. There, I'll tell you, there were so many acronyms, and I said, wow. I wish I could master all of them, but here, they are less, but I think I'll manage. Then fourth is the setting up of a functional forensic lab that will help auditors and investigators uncover hidden financial transactions and trace illicit financial flows. Given the global nature of markets and business operations, political support needs to be coordinated across countries to ensure that tax regimes race to the middle. I know earlier on, I think there was a mention of race to the bottom, but here we're saying we should ensure that the tax regimes race to the middle and not to the bottom. Important tax issues on double taxation, information sharing and enforcement, offshore financial centers, and effective regional tax rules all require some level of enhanced global and regional cooperation. I must also hasten to mention that the whole of government approach to combat money laundering and other financial crimes, as advocated for by the OECD, needs to be embraced, recognizing that knowledge and skills required to effectively fight against these offenses are often spread across different bodies such as tax administration, financial intelligence units, specialized criminal law enforcement authorities, financial regulators, and the Public Prosecutor's Office. Addressing the scourge of illicit financial flows also requires strong international cooperation and concerted efforts of stakeholders, both developed and in developing countries, the private sector, and civil society. I therefore implore all the stakeholders gathered here to ensure that the fight for tax justice is upscaled through invigorated collaborative efforts on equal footing without, as they now say, leaving anyone behind. So as I conclude, I'd like to thank all of you for making it to this important conference, and I hope you've all had your safe travels, and like Mr. Mwaipopo indicated, any sort of housekeeping issues where you require support, they'll be available to attend to those. But I hope over the 2 days you also find time to explore more about Lusaka so that you have a very memorable time while you've been here, and I hope we will serve them our traditional dishes so that they sample them. And as I say, with these words, and I hope they've been very few, it is indeed my singular honor and privilege to officially open this conference. I thank you, and God bless you all. Thank you.
I think the PS deserves a bigger clap. And as I was seated there, and PS spoke about your time here, enjoying traditional dishes. Somebody sent me a message and asked whether you will be serving traditional beer. I don't know whether that is an offer that we can take you up for. And as you spoke about the late KK, the Lord bless his soul, he kept saying that he invented the Kaunda suit. But when he came visiting Kenya, the Kenyans took it and made it theirs. And they started selling it. And so today we have Kaunda suit, and it looks like it came from Kenya, but the rightful owner could be the Kaundas. So thank you, Alvin, Mary, Isaac, and PS for your great opening remarks. And we want to take a group photo now. And once you walk outside this door, there's the main entrance that leads us outside. That's where we will be taking the group photo. Immediately after the group photo, you can have your tea, which is going to be served in the lobby. And then we will come back here at 10:30 to commence with the next session. So I want to invite you to, because we want to take a photo with you, PS. We will be led by Alvin, Mary, and Isaac and the PS to walk out. And then we will take the photo outside, have tea, and come back at 10:30. Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, honorable members, if we can follow now. Yes. Yeah, no problem. You can leave your bags, your laptops, they'll be safe.
Water. Two. Okay, good to go. Good to go. Chap. I see a switch. So chat. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Go. 1, 2.
1, 2, check mic, 1, 2. 1, 2, check mic, 1. 1, 2, check mic, 1, 2, 1, 2, check mic, 1, 2.
So we want to welcome you to the session after break. And thank you for walking in on time, even before anybody came to request you to walk back in. We want to get into the next session. And before we do that, I'm looking for Mukasiri. You're ready? We have a group of online participants, and the online participants, since we have taken a group photo, I think it is important for them to also take a group photo. So our online participants, if you can hear me, we would want to request you to turn on your video for a minute. If you're in a place that you feel is requires you to blur your background, please do it. We will be taking a group photo for everyone that is online. I therefore request the technical team to display for us the online screen and how it looks like. And as we are preparing for that, online team, please prepare to turn on your video in 1 minute from now. And as we are preparing for that, I want to draw your attention to a floating document that is on your table. And it just says PARC 2022 at the top. And then it asks you, which do you prefer? Please select only one. That's the document I'm referring to. My colleagues are helping to get it to you. So if you don't have that document, you can raise your hand and my colleagues will get it to you. So Evelyn, we have a couple of hands on this side. So if you can help, a couple of hands. If you don't have that document that asks you, which do you prefer? So if you look at our program, later this afternoon we will have a couple of breakaway sessions. And we would want to get a sense of which breakaway sessions you prefer to attend. And that is the sole goal of the paper that you have in front of you. So we just want you to read that in correlation to the program and just identify which side session you want to attend and just make a mark on the side session you want to attend. And then you just pass that list to the person who is sitting at the last side of your table. So if you're seated on that side, the lists will just come to this side. You don't have to indicate your name. because we just need to get a sense of the numbers. In addition to that, later this afternoon, we have four side sessions. I know your program indicates 3, but there's one that was missed as it was being printed. There is a side session organized by Oxfam and Femnet on IFFs, gender, and inequality. So, if you look at 1, 2, 3, 1 means the breakaway sessions that will happen immediately after session 2 in the afternoon, and 3 means the side sessions that will happen later in the evening. So IFF's gender and inequality will be the 4th side session that will happen at that time. If you would want to attend that session, please indicate by writing. So if we can go to the online audience, and if we can have the names displayed, or the screen that has the online participants displayed. I am also informed that internet is a little slow. Please bear with us. I think it's because of the numbers. Online screen, if it is taking, almost there. So participants, please turn on your videos. The group photo is coming up in a few seconds from now. How many do we have online currently, Mukasiri? How many? Yeah, so I'm informed there are some technical challenges in getting their photo taken, but we acknowledge all the online participants and we encourage you to follow the sessions. And as we get into the next session, I want to invite Crystal Simeoni, who will be moderating the next session, to also invite to the stage the speakers for the next session.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a little short, and this is right in front of my face. I hope I'm not destabilizing anything. Good morning, everyone. Is interpretation working? Can Francophone participants hear me okay? We're good? Great. Portuguese? We're good. Great. I'd like to invite up with me Ms. Irene Ovonji, Mr. Charles Abugre, Mr. Titus Gramende, and Mr. Dingani Banda. If you're in the room, please join me up on the stage. Where's Charles? Charles. Francis, do they need to come up here for translation, or can I give them the roving mic? Welcome, everyone. My name is Crystal Simeoni. I'm director at NAWI, the NAWI Collective. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm really, really honored to be here today. The 15th Pan-African Conference, it's really huge. It's something for this continent, and what a privilege to be here with all of you. I was given the daunting task of moderating today's session, which really sets the pace for the next 2 days. And it's setting the scene and unpacking the theme, tax justice amid multiple crises. And so this session will focus on understanding this theme of multiple crises. And it really seems, and I know we've talked a lot about the 3 Cs, our issues today confronting the continent around climate, debt, the war in Ukraine. But I think Titus Gramende, opening Monday's APNIFT meeting, spoke about how this is not a new space of multiple crises for Africa. Our continent has constantly and consistently faced multiple crises, from conflict to climate impacts, to growing inequalities, to deep violence against women in multiple forms, from economic, physical, and more. Our power struggles, I need to use both. These are a lot of microphones. Our power struggles with the global north and so many more. And we must remember that all oppression is connected, and Africa is many a time a perfect example of this. Part of this struggle and part of why we're here is a question on how we raise the resources in a fair, a just, and equitable manner to be able to provide dignified lives for our people. We have today with us a panel of some of Africa's greatest thought leaders with us to share their thoughts, their experiences, and their ideas for alternatives to frame the conversation over the next 2 days. Ladies and gentlemen, we are world making, and let's not forget that. The little children who joined us to sing the national anthem were a stark reminder of this. We're here to build a world for our African children, and the burden is really heavy. And the burden must be centered around building economies centered on care for these little children, whether we're collecting revenue, whether we're budgeting, and how we distribute resources equitably and face, growing power disparities in the global economy. So with us today to start, I will invite Mr. Charles Abugre, who is current Executive Director of Ideas Africa, a development economist whose research areas are in public finance, poverty and inequalities, and natural resource governance. He has co-authored publications in international taxation and tax justice, African debt and development finance, and is a regular contributor to the African Governance Report and the African Economic Report published by the UN ECA. He was previously a senior public servant to the government of Ghana, a regional director for the UN Millennium Campaign UNDP, and head of research and policy at Christian Aid UK, and a lecturer at the Swansea University in the UK. He will speak for about 20 minutes, and I will follow with our other panelists to comment on his intervention. Welcome, Mr. Abugre.
My apologies. I was told by Alvin that I was working on Ghanaian time, but which means Ghanaian time is rather on time. 11 o'clock is 11 o'clock. So I disappeared a little bit. My apologies for keeping you waiting. Thanks for the kind introduction, Crystal. Let me just say a couple of things before a couple of things. And thanks for Tax Justice Network Africa for inviting me to do the scene-setting remarks. I'm honored. So a couple of preliminary remarks. First, about ideas. Always never lose an opportunity to advertise. So Ideas International Development Economics Associates. It's a bunch of economists and political economists that want to bring development back into economics. So it does research, and it runs courses, and we try to share alternative views So you can find a little bit about ideas at our website, www.networkideas.org. The second is the theme. I am pleased that although the focus is on domestic revenue mobilization, it is in the context of a much broader agenda, which is tax justice. What does that mean at a time of multiple interlocking crises? I just wanted to emphasize that tax justice component. So we keep our conversations about IFFs and revenue mobilization, domestic revenue mobilization within that context. Tax justice is a normative concept. It suggests that we are committed to a certain society in which tax and taxation plays a role. Let's remind ourselves what that is. In my view, the purpose of tax and taxation is to contribute to a healthy, thriving, peaceful societies and a healthy planet. As a tool, there are mechanisms. It has specific functions to do this. There's a revenue component, which we want to discuss today, deep in today. But in raising revenue and spending revenue, there's a societal impact. It has a distributive impact. So the justice part of it is that the way we raise that revenue and spend it must redistribute to create a healthier, equitable society. It has an incentive changing impact, repricing, which means it's a tool we want to use even as we raise revenue to bring about certain changes in behavior in our society. And it has a political aspect, which is the only reason, for example, to justify why a poor person that earns an income insufficient to keep body and soul together is made to pay taxes. It's simply that the person is sacrificing a component of their livelihoods in order to be part of building a society, to have a voice. Now, all of these elements are implicated in what happens in our society nationally and globally. So my first comment is this. We are not yet, in my view, totally sold in our countries on the idea that the purpose of taxation is to bring about a certain type of society. There is a political economy element in that. When we are not sold on it, the rest of what we do is mechanical. It's not transformative. So I would like to keep that in mind as we look at multiple crises and I draw out a few of those elements and explain these relationships. The second is the crisis that we are talking about. So the few that I would like to pull out just for teasers, keep in mind that they are interlocking and multiple in nature. So one interlocks with the other, and the effects can cascade. They are interlocking in the way in which they affect the conditions for raising revenue, the way in which they affect the conditions for bringing about equitable and peaceful societies through taxation, and the way in which they influence our ability to bring about a healthy planet and save it from extinction. And so it is in this context that our discussion even on domestic resource mobilization must look way beyond the question of tax revenues and the efficiency and effectiveness of tax revenues. So my last, therefore, preliminary remark is that domestic resource mobilization for us must be founded in the ability and its ability not only to raise it, but also in raising it, that it brings about that transformative element that is inherent in the concept of tax justice. So now we are meeting here, I think, at a rather delicate time in human society. We are moving from a health pandemic that they say has killed a minimum of 6 million people and counting, into what I called the best of the clouds of wars. Now, I say the best of the clouds of war because war is raging. But perhaps the mother of all wars may be yet to come. So, on the COVID side, for the first time in 2020, after 25 years, this continent went into recession. So remember, in the 70s and 80s, the continent went into a reverse, a deindustrialization reverse. In the 1990s, it stabilized a little bit and then started to take off in the early 2020s. This was when the concept of Africa rising, a more optimistic picture of the came about. And then, even as the contradictions of the African so-called rising and renaissance was being debated, COVID came around and the continent went into recession. A recent report by Afrexim says, it's a very optimistic one, the continent has come out of recession. Unlike Europe and the threat in North America, there are many problems, but we can look optimistically because there are sufficient conditions to suggest that the continent would stay out of recession, growth will decelerate, but it will continue to be positive. But that period led to a major reversal in many ways which are long-lasting. It led to a contraction in revenue. It accelerated a debt problem, which I will come to. And it also helped to exacerbate an already rapidly rising in intra-country inequalities trajectory that the continent was facing. As a result, the continent, unlike others, were unable to spend their way out of the problem. So unlike advanced countries and G20 countries that increased their expenditures by nearly 7% of GDP to nearly 40% of GDP, the continent only managed to raise expenditure by marginally 1% over and above an already low percentage GDP expenditure. And so, for that reason, the ability to grow the revenue base in order to be able to address existing obligations, including debt, has declined, and debt has risen quite significantly. This declining revenue, combination of declining revenue, inadequate expenditure to sustain growth, and rising debt, that prospect in 2020 led the African Union and its related organs to ask the world for $100 billion a year for 3 years, each for 3 years, in order to be able to address the effects of COVID and to go forward. I think we are all witnesses of what has been possible to deliver. The best that has been delivered was a very low SDR allocation to the continent and a G20 framework, which is really hasn't delivered any debt relief. So, but in that context, the pressure on the continent to finance its own development is further constrained. Let me make this point very clear. Domestic revenue mobilization is premised on the ability of the continent to grow, and the sectors that contribute to rapid growth to be able to pay revenues, and we will come to that, and an overall income distribution through public expenditure that is able to lift all boats so that those at the middle and the bottom are able to contribute to the tax net. This remains constrained. One of the reasons why it remains constrained is the structure of the continent's economy as we know. It is predominantly commodity dependent. Of the 50 most commodity dependent economies in the world, 24 are African. And a number of them two commodities, as we know, for more than 80 to 90% of export revenues. Now, within that structure, an extraction-related economy that has very little, sideways and horizontal linkages makes it difficult to broaden the income base for domestic revenue mobilization. So when there is a crisis, which also hits the main export base of the economy, it also then depresses the ability to raise domestic revenue. And it's in this context that the current pressure imposed by the proxy war in NATO, in Ukraine, and the drums of war that are beating in the South China Sea contribute to our inability to create the conditions for domestic revenue mobilization, because we are exceedingly dependent in the revenue bracket on the ability to extract and export raw commodities at prices that are reasonably remunerative. That is the external part of it. The second external part of the potential impact and current impact of the pressures of war that we are facing is on the foods, is on food. And so in the last couple of years, starting from COVID, food insecurity has risen dramatically. Food insecurity is projected to rise even more. The FAO suggests that nearly 52% of African population are food insecure at the moment, and in more than 60% are projected to be even more in food insecure. But let's keep one point in mind. Ukraine war contributes to it. COVID contributes to it. But food insecurity on the continent has already been rising steadily from the year 2000 up till the year 2019, before the war broke. So food insecurity is a permanent factor and is again embedded in the structure of our economy, our inability to create productivity increases in agriculture. But food insecurity is also not just a matter of food prices. It is a matter of the manner of food speculation, the traders of food and the ingredients of food, including inputs. So if you look at the relationship between the food supply and the food prices, FAO has shown very clearly that the speculative component of the market and the fact that the distribution of global food and global inputs are controlled by a small percentage of multinational companies is a big explanatory factor of food insecurity to this continent. So keep in mind, it's not only a production issue, it's not only a supply issue, it is a trading and speculation issue as well. And so as we discuss the continent's, the pressures on food and food insecurity that is rising on the continent, we also need to have a sense of the nature of the global market of food. The third area that I would like to emphasize, which I mentioned earlier, is what I call the bonds of debt. Now, we have a particular problem. The particular problem is that the continent's rate of debt accumulation is not only increasing, it did so in the 80s and 1990s. It was more easily solvable because it was public debt. The continent's bond of debt are private debt. So it is that rapid growth in the nature of debt that has become a new problem for the continent, which is that our debt is now tradable. It's in the hands of a few individuals and companies. It becomes absolutely difficult. As Zambia's experience might have shown, the attempt by Ethiopia to take advantage of the global framework for debt relief has also shown that to tackle private debt is not as easy as to tackle public debt. But there is a way to tackle private debt. And this debt is important because if the source of if our effort to raise domestic revenue simply ends up transferring those revenues to a few to private pockets in a manner that also basically forces us to mortgage the only assets that we have, which is our natural resources, then the ability to sustain domestic revenue mobilization in the future declines progressively. So the private debt market and Africa's embracing of the private bond market has created a new dynamic which debt campaigners and tax justice campaigners ought to take a very careful look at. And it is this intersection between revenue and the debt restructuring process that we have to be involved in. As you know, Ghana is going into a debt restructuring similar to Zambia. Malawi is in line. Ethiopia, when the war subsides, may also be in line. Kenya is under pressure to restructure. Therefore, we cannot think separately about raising revenue without being deeply involved in the process and the choices that are made in the debt restructuring processes as the IMF increases its influences on our continent. So our appeal would be this. It's not now only about raising revenue. It is about who pays that revenue. It's about who gets that revenue. And it's about who shoulders the cost of the generation of that revenue. And it's about whether or not it is fair and just for the revenue to be collected from poor people and transferred to a few private pockets. So that debt issue underpins now very strongly the continent's prospects and for domestic resource mobilization and what to do with it. As you know, debt drains revenues. So you raise it and it drains it. So if you raise it and it drains it, unless we find a way to plug it, it's impossible to use revenue and reinvest it for the purpose of creating just, peaceful, and prosperous societies, for which tax justice requires us to do. Now, the third area to just flag is the climate vulnerability issue. And there's a very interesting paper that's currently, that recently been published by an American, one of those American research organizations that looks at what they call the V20 countries, which is the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable economies on the continent. There are 55 countries. Of these 55 most climate vulnerable countries, 21 of them are African countries. And almost all of them are debt distressed, at a high risk of debt distress, and only a couple of them are moderately at risk of debt distress. And therefore, the debt issue and the climate financing questions are intricately linked. And so as we struggle to find resources to finance the climate adaptation for us and a little bit of climate mitigation, the prospect is that climate finance may indirectly find its way into servicing debt. So tax justice must be interested in the way in which the climate financing agenda grows and where the money is channeled once countries tap into climate finance. Now, just to say a number of concluding remarks. So tax justice looks at two elements of tax abuse: the international dimension of tax abuse and the domestic dimension of tax abuse. The international dimension of tax abuse is definitely much larger than the domestic dimension of tax abuse. That had already been proven and shown long ago by the Mbeki report, increasingly published by the Tax Justice Network, state of taxation reports, and so on and so forth. But that international tax abuse, the largest component of losses, although are to developed countries, the largest proportion of tax losses are to developing countries, especially Africa. So the latest report suggests that the last years or so, there's an average of about $25 billion that the continent loses to international corporate tax abuse, which is a bit different from international private personal tax abuse. So as we address the question of international tax abuse, the corporate tax abuse is central to us. Why? Because it is also inherent, it's built into the structure of our participation in global trade. Where do we get our money from? The extraction and export of natural resources. If that is the biggest component of the corporate sector in our continent, followed by the financial sector, which is international finance, banking and insurance, and only a little bit followed by the real estate sector. But the biggest sector is the extraction and export of natural resources. And these are also the channels through which the biggest corporate tax abuse happens. So if we lose the ability to track the extraction of our resources, and the abuse is not only profit shifting, it is also profit giveaways by governments. Our inability to charge the appropriate royalties, our inability to impose the appropriate corporate taxes, our inability to assess the real value of the natural resources that we have. Those are profit giveaways. Those are our responsibility to prevent. So as we fight tax abuse, we zero down on corporate tax abuse. Corruption is definitely a factor which facilitates, but it's a corporate tax abuse. That corporate tax abuse is international in nature. It is also local in nature. So as we work with our governments, if we are really interested in tax justice, our governments ought to build a little bit more courage in addressing the giveaways that we do in profits that then add up to the profit shifting practices which we talk about. Now there are some useful positive signals in the arena, so it's not all negative, although some positives are themselves something to step back about. So climate finance. We know of the G7's infrastructure fund. A large part of it is supposed to be green climate funds, and so on and so forth. $11 billion will be to support the climate financing and so on. But that's a Trojan horse. we ought to be interested in this infrastructure fund, not only because we need infrastructure for development, but this infrastructure fund also carries with certain potentials. One is it will accelerate extraction. And that extraction, both of fossil fuels, but also the new fourth generation minerals. And therefore, our tax justice agenda may also wish to start paying attention to the new fourth generation minerals, the rare earths, the nickels, and the other things that go into green technology, and so on and so forth. It could also facilitate a lot of tensions, geopolitical tensions. So keep an eye on this. They're important for financing our development, but they also can carry a Trojan horse. They can be another mechanism for rapid extraction of profits and resources from the continent. The final point I want to make, of course, is that many of you here have been fighting for the UN Tax Convention, and the Secretary General just released his report, basically favoring many of the things that tax campaigners have been given, and they have backed the ECA, resolution on the establishment of, a UN tax convention. But this is only the beginning. It has some principles that includes, collaboration, consultations, and so on and so forth. It is only when we are continue to be engaged, not only at the international level, but the implications of the tax convention for national policy, that the convention has value to us at the national level. So positive to go forward, Trojan horses to walk through. Please keep in mind that a tax justice agenda is one that helps to maximize domestic revenue, but also to help create an equitable and just society. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I made space for you, so. Wow. I sometimes feel very overwhelmed with the multiple crises, but a little bit of hope comes from that we're in the hands of Africans' foremost thought leaders like Charles, like Titus, like Irene, like the people in this room. And so that gives me a little bit of hope to fight another day. So thank you so much, Charles. I took a few things, keeping body and soul together. It's core to the feminist movement that I am part of, moving from mechanical to the transformative. And in this conversation, where is the revenue coming from and how do we spend it? And how is it done in a fair, just, and equitable manner that centers our people as we do? And it's clear that our problems did not start with COVID. They did not start with the war in Ukraine. They have been long, they have been struggling, our people have been struggling. And the correlations of the debt question with that of climate is inextricably linked, and we must be intersectional in our response. And so to comment on Charles's intervention, I would like to invite Mr. Titus Gramende, Division Director for Opportunity and Equity at the Open Society Foundation. Titus is Division Director, like I said, where he provides overall strategic leadership of investments in 25 target countries on this continent, which work primarily on economic governance, resource economics, climate change, amongst others. He has over 15 years working in senior roles of local and international organizations, and he most recently was the Southern African Regional Lead for Natural Resource Governance with Oxfam International, where he contributed in building a multi-country and multi-partner resource governance program in the SADC region. He holds an MA from the Ohio University. He's also a past fellow at Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, and he's gone through the Leadership Academy for Development targeted at emerging leaders in the Global South through a joint program developed by Johns Hopkins and the University of Cape Town. Welcome, Titus. And as you come up, I'd like to ask you, after Charles's intervention, how do you see African countries and the majority world coming together to provide leadership with all these multiple and ongoing crises, and our historical crises as well? And is there sufficient scope for a relook at the global financial architecture in the same way the global tax system has begun to be relooked? I don't know if we have successes there, but we're definitely on the way. And how do you think developing countries would benefit from such an undertaking? Or should this be something led by the African Union? With all its problems, it's still ours. And so we're interested to hear in 10 minutes, what do you think?
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, my senior, for speaking with such devastating clarity. Thank you, organizers. Colleagues, I don't bring you hope. I bring you truth and a message of justice, because I think that's probably the message we need. The organizers, I think, did something very good in how they framed this. Takes justice in the age of multiple crises. And we know the multiple crises, the 3 C's that shape currently international politics. Perhaps in the next few decades, we're going to be talking and fighting and debating around COVID, conflict, and climate change. And combined together, the impact is felt the most on the bodies of people with color. And if something does not happen, a combination of this toxic concoction of crisis is going to unleash a vicious centrifugal forces that will lead to conflict, potential violence, if not current violence that we're seeing. So we have to sit up straight and say, no, we are smarting from almost like the 1948 moment. You remember when we were emerging out of a war, except we are not thinking or talking like we are emerging out of a war. And so I want to start by saying the message that is talking about that it's beyond raising revenue, but how do you raise it, I think is spot on. For one thing, and I'll explain where we raise the revenue. I think in 1945, 1948, when the world was starting from the World War II, you remember, there was carnage across Europe. And a man called George C. Marshall rose up and said, we're going to have a Marshall Plan, which was massive investment of cash to rebuild infrastructure across Europe. One time I was minding my own business on the internet recently on 8 August 2020, there was an article by World Economic Forum saying, do we need a Marshall Plan for Europe? As if Europe was the only place where COVID has happened. But there was a recognition that to come out of this multiple crisis, you need some kind of Marshall Plan, which is a massive investment of cash that's cheap, sustainable, for countries to recover. This is how Japan recovered. This is how Europe recovered. It's only Africa where you are emerging out of a war-like situation where we are being told to be fiscally responsible. Can you imagine coming out of World War II? You tell Europe, leaders need to be fiscally responsible. You need to catch your wage bill. You need to rein in corruption. Of course you need to rein in corruption. But I do think African leadership need to take leadership around how we sequence message of recovery. And the message of recovery is first justice. Justice over who did this crisis. And I do think when you look at Africa, we're not the reason why we have a climate change crisis. I mean, we are not the reason why Pakistan is submerged in water 1/3, why Mozambique had Cyclone Idai. This is anthropogenic. In other words, it is people who caused this. We know these people, but there is no industrial revolution in UK or in the US without fossil fuels. That basically ended up causing this climate crisis that we feel in Africa. And so to recover out of this crisis, there has to be first justice and revenue or money raised or paid for us to adapt to our new reality. And for me, that's a crucial point. Massive revenue, adaptation finance for African countries to recover. Without that, colleagues, no amount of fiscal discipline will take us out of this. It's almost like telling, and sorry to use this crude language, a young woman who's just been raped, and the first message you tell them is to have self-image, to have self-esteem. to be wary of boys next time and self-defense. No. She needs justice first. And we can talk about other things. So I do think we need loss and damages, and this is a message of leadership across worldwide leaders. We're going to COP, we're going everywhere. We need the loss and damage facility. We need adaptation finance. We need some kind of debt cancellation for sovereign debt to give us some kind of space to breathe. Without that, we are not. And some will say, no, that's not practical. You know, Kuruma, when he was talking about African unity, it didn't seem practical. But I do think it has to be said, whether it's practical, whether it's going to happen or not, it has to be said that without some kind of adaptation finance that comes from those who caused this, we are not going to recover. Why is this important? Because when you're climate ravaged, you actually can't access cheaper money. In fact, you get the most expensive money on the market because you're climate vulnerable, which doesn't make sense. You would imagine that we operate in a system in which those who are most disadvantaged are the ones who are attended to first. And so we had the IMF sit down, $650 billion worth of SDRs, and it is about 35 or 33 billion that came to our countries. So a system that rewards the richest during crisis and ignores the poor during crisis is a deeply problematic system. And I do think African leadership should speak with one voice. At the moment, we have Prime Minister Maya Motley and a few other voices. I do think we need a chorus of African leaders, civil society, combining with other global South leaders to talk about the need to reform a problematic financial architecture and international financial institutions so that they actually have money that responds to the kind of needs we have. So that is the second point. We need global South. We need African leaders to work together in aggressive solidarity across. Call it the Southern Consensus, moving from Washington Consensus to the Southern Consensus, where we start engaging each other and speak with one voice around we need to change this within IMF, the way it decides decisions, its quotas, its ways of disbursing money. We need to speak with one voice. You can't have Nairobi talk about this. You can't have South Africa speak with one voice. You want Argentina, you want Brazil, you want Africa to all speak in a chorus at the annual meetings, at COP, and in all other spaces that we need to change the way we are structured. So that is all crucial. We need to speak at the leadership level, but I think at the intellectual level, I do want to agree that it is important for deeper intellectual collaborations across the different geographic. Some of you who grew up reading Paulo Ferreira will have realized or will have noticed the deep influence he had all of us in our thinking, the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I do think at an intellectual level, we need that deeper intellectual collaboration across the global South to write on the issues of injustice that is coming out of the post-crisis that we are going through. So that is intellectual level engagement, that is states engaging at a global level. But I want to quickly finish off with addressing some of the things that we could do, because we've got agency as African leaders, or as Africans. The aspect around African agency, that there are things that we can do ourselves as civil society and as African governments. And one of them is to revisit or reinvigorate the discussion around state capacity. I think we have to strengthen. An African state that is not strong cannot respond to future crises. And so investing in the multiple layers of state capacity will be strong. So your tax administration, your health, your social policy is going to be crucial. And I want to talk about social policy because at the moment all our countries are negotiating bailouts. And the biggest loser is social policy. We talk about it in speech, but we are literally being made to gut our hearts, our intestines, just so that we save our thumbnails. You cannot sacrifice social policy and hope to recover out of this. So central to state capacity is the need to do social protection, to strengthen accountability and capacity of our pension funds. Perhaps on all things around social policy, I want to emphasize on pension funds, because this is what annoys me the most. Walk across Zambia, Lusaka, Nairobi, South Africa, the beautiful malls that you are seeing, it is pension funds. But when you go to Scandinavia, when you see electrical power stations, when you see schools, massive hospitals, nice roads, that was social policy, that was pension funds. And so we have to reorient our pension funds in the age of post-COVID, and to say pension funds are at the core of Africa's transformation project. That is where we get revenue to invest in long-term projects, whether it's clean energy, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's health. At the moment, this nonsense around building malls that sell foreign products is not the role of pension funds. So as civil society, we need to hold social funds to account. We put a lot of pressure on tax administration, and we should. But we have to start getting interested in social funds. I mean, I worked in Mozambique for about 7 years. I went to Social Security asking for money. I never got it. Just getting to the office was impossible, and I have a chance, most of you. If you come from any African country, can you tell me the CEO of your pension fund? You contribute every month. But one of the most shadowy individuals within the African continent are CEOs of pension funds. They are looting and doing things that we don't even know with the money that all of us contribute. So in terms of African agents, we can do better about African pension funds. We can do better around generation, management, and expenditure. That we should be able to do better. And I do think it is within ourselves that Africans can rise up and say, this is how we do. The best hospitals are not in Dubai, they are in Africa. The best universities are in Africa. We would not have been liberated had it not been for the intellectual contribution of Dar es Salaam, Ibadan, Jos, University of Zimbabwe. And so to recover from post-COVID, we need to reinvest in the African Academy, in our healthcare. That is part of state capacity. And that is something African leaders need to lead and not just look at that. We have to be proud of going to African university again. We have to be proud of going to an African school again. And we have to get to that to a point. In my own institution, we do grant making and impact investment. Part of the money will going to come from impact investment. Impact investment is cheaper money, sustainable finance for a green recovery. And we need to look for more of those money, whether it's updation finance, whether it's money we raise through tax, or it's cheaper money that we could find to invest in innovative ideas in climate, in infrastructure, in agriculture. We will need to that money, and we are doing that in our small way. So I want to emphasize or to congratulate my brother Charles for what he has said. To get out of a multi-layered, multi-connected crisis, we will need a multidisciplinary, multi-domain lens to look at it. Your own capacity as a civil society. You can't see yourself as a tax justice person. You can't see yourself as an EI person. You now have to look at what David Eastpain says range. We need to develop that professional and institutional range in which you know tax, but you know the other subjects, because they don't come to you in one dimension. They come to you in a multi-dimension and intersectional sense. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Titus. Indeed, I'm tired of being a resilient African woman. And so we must center our struggle around justice. And I'll push it further, justice and reparations. And we need the space to breathe. So I join you in the call from moving from a Washington consensus to a Southern consensus. And our liberation will and must come from our united push and our united chorus. I now will welcome Ms. Irene Ovonji, FACTI panel member. She's a lawyer, a women's rights activist, a member of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows from the Mbeki panel. She's also served on the Independent Commission for Reform of International Corporate Tax, ICRIT, and on the Pan-African Lawyers Union Task Force on Illicit Financial Flows. Irene, as you come up, I'd like to ask you, with regional institutions such as the African Union, which have a huge role to play in helping Africa overcome these multiple crises, what change in approach and strategy is needed at the regional level to ensure that these regional institutions are playing a proper role to foster the change across the continent? And what further role does the UN have in all of this? Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Crystal. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, I think this is a really good session because we are brainstorming, we're thinking these things through. I think part of the challenge that we have in a lot of civil society today, especially in Africa, I don't know about other regions, is that partly because of funding modalities, there's a lot of emphasis on activities, on action, on projects, and much less space for thinking. We need a balance between the doing and the thinking. So the intellectual capital is as important as the actions, as implementation. So this is a really good approach, especially because there's a whole range of actors in here, and I really want to commend TJNA and ATA for that, and the other organizations that you're working with. As has already been said, both by Charles and Titus and Crystal and others, this is the multiple dimensions, challenges to the crisis that we face in Africa. And so the solutions also have to look at multiple aspects and multiple dimensions. Apart from being part of civil society, the women's movement in Africa, and also being involved on work against illicit financial flows with the Mbeki panel, FACTI panel, TJNA, and other organizations, I've also been a member of parliament from the East African Parliament. And there's some insights that gave me around regional integration and the African continent and development. So I want to start off, first of all, by saying that these issues are political. It is political. So if we're looking at tax justice, if we're looking at all the issues that you raised, Charles, we need to remember that ultimately it's a political fight. And I think one of the challenges that we've had in the past maybe 20, 30 years, I'm from an older generation, but one of the challenges in the past 20, 30 years is the politicization of the fight for justice. So a lot of it has become very technical, and there's space for technical. We have to balance between the political and the technical. And it's great that there's been a massive investment in building technical capacity, even on these issues of global tax justice. You need that as well. But we must balance that with the political, because ultimately it's a political issue. Primarily because we are talking about vested interests. And if I were to sum up everything that has been said today, in this session, ultimately for me, we're talking about empire and imperialism. That's what it is. So all the issues we're looking at, whether we're talking about the global financial system, the global economic system, whatever it is ultimately about the old imperial order and the new faces that it has adapted and adopted. And how do you take that down? I know from being in Parliament that policymakers and decision makers respond to power. Ultimately, they respond to power. And that power can come from different places. In our African context, it's often military, and the global context as well, it's often military. But power. So how do you build power in a movement for justice? And in a global movement for justice? Because we're talking about a system that is built on extraction, a system that is built on inequality. It's not about principles. We have the UN Charter and everything. I'm a lawyer, human rights, all of that. Yes, you have that. But then when it comes down to real decisions, it comes down to power. And this is what we've seen with the OECD process, the BEPS process. It didn't matter, what fantastic rationales and arguments were raised, and they were raised, and technical arguments and everything, and a very truthful one. But ultimately, when you look at the contortions of that deal, the OECD BEPS deal, you see that it's ultimately about a particular outcome that needed to be achieved. Increasing taxing rights for the rich and protecting global corporations, basically. So all those contortions and complexities respond to that. So how do you build power in the global south? How do you build power in global coalitions for justice? And there are some openings that we can see. For me, even the crisis that we see today, in itself, it raises the arguments for change. It brings more people into the 99%. For a long time, we had a situation where the effects of the global economic system and the financial system were largely felt in the global south. But increasingly, with the intensification of the neoliberal models of development and the continuation of extraction, it's now being felt much more in the quote-unquote capitals. So in the global north as well, you see the increase of inequality within countries in the global north. And that creates an opening to build global coalitions. Two of the key messages that I'd like us to remember as we're fighting for tax justice and fighting against illicit financial flows. One of them, and for me this is a major learning, both from the Becky panel and from the FACTI panel, and something we really need to constantly reiterate, is one has already been said, about commercial IFFs being the crux of the problem. I remember with the Becky panel, what was clear from all the analysis was that 65% of IFS from Africa were from commercial drivers, largely from tax and trade abuse, while majority of the global architecture was focusing on corruption and criminality, much less on the finance, taxation, and so on. And so there's a need to focus much more on that, the financial architecture around taxation, which was picked up by the OECD, but taken in the wrong direction, back to protecting the interests of rich countries and the interests of the rich in rich countries. So we need to get back to that basics, the basic issue around commercial. And some of the things that are mentioned here about the crisis, so with commodities, for example, I recall years ago reading the South Journal, I forget the name, it focuses on agriculture, and it has collaboration of researchers from Zimbabwe, from India, I think from Brazil, and a couple of other countries. But one of the things I remember, one of the volumes I was looking at, was talking about the agriculture crisis, and it made a link that preceding every global financial crisis, there has been a global food crisis, and that economists don't make that connection. So the real economy, food, agriculture, and so on, ultimately has an impact on, the financial situation, which is where we know the world today, the decision makers, the powers that be, are more interested in that, the financial economy and all of that. But there is a real link between it and the real economy, so agriculture and food. So unpacking some of those things and getting policymakers to understand those connections and why issues like agriculture, issues like social security and so on that Titus talked about, why are those things important? I remember years ago doing some research, part of a process the East African community was doing around political federation and what are the issues and so on. And in doing that analysis, just coming to understanding, realization that certain basic factors have to be addressed in order to achieve development and to achieve a regional integration that achieves development for its citizens. So certain basic sectors one has to deal with. Trade was one of them, agriculture was another, labor, the human beings, and health. So those are some of the key factors that African governments and African peoples we need to prioritize. So the social sector is one of them. And of course we know that in the past, again, 30, 40 years, with this whole Washington consensus and the neoliberal model of development, those are the very spaces that have been completely laid bare. There is no resources, the government structures for them have been cut back. So moving forward, I think we must challenge the neoliberal model of development, and research has to be put back into that and to connect that to the fight for tax justice and a global fiscal reform. Ultimately, we're talking about how is development going to be achieved. And the arguments are there. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the past 30 years, the evidence is out there. But the narrative around how development can be achieved has not changed. And instead, we see expansion, continued financialization of the economy. We see the movement of hedge funds into the social sector and so on in the global north. But that, again, for me, raises possibilities of building global coalitions, but which must be led by the global south. So ultimately, it's politics and its interests that we have to think about. It's the 1% and the 99% versus the 99%. So while we have the majority, how do we organize better? I would really, to come to the question that was raised to me, as Africa, yes, absolutely. I think the solution has to be internal. So the Global South, Africa, has to look inward. I think that was said earlier on today as well, has to look inward to find a solution. The AU needs to recognize and really follow through on some of the achievements, some of the things that were done. For example, it is Africa that really pioneered this work around illicit financial flows from the official perspective. There was work being done in civil society, yes, and all of that. But if you look at what happened with the Mbeki panel, with the AU ministers, with the AU Special Declaration in 2015 on illicit financial flows, Africa really led. And it was a pivotal moment that helped to shape the response of the Addis Ababa Agreement and also the SDGs on illicit financial flows, the placement of that issue within there. So Africa led. But since then, the follow-up on that has not been as profound as happened up to 2015. So Africa and the AU, I really call on the African Union Commission to take the lead once again in driving the agenda around illicit financial flows. Is critical because, as we know, the beneficiaries of IFFs are the Global North. So IFFs contribute to extraction of wealth from the Global South, Africa and other places, to the Global North. The international finance centers, London and so on. I mean, when you look at the role of the former colonial powers, it's quite evident that those are the centers where the flows go. There is the misperception quite often when we talk about tax havens and financial secrecy that these are located in those exotic Caribbean locations. It is the Global North. So we are talking about the role of the UK, with its global network on financial secrecy and the offshore system. We're talking about the USA, which I think is #1 now in the financial secrecy index. Not a good thing. You talk about the role of the Netherlands and so on. So it is those are the countries which are benefiting from the status quo. So they are not about to change it. So we must look inward. It has to be an African-driven process. So I would urge civil society, for starters, working together, working across sectors, and having a common agenda or roadmap that different civil society actors are all working towards is really fundamental. And then engaging with official Africa, as I like to call it, African governments, to get a similar thing. And the AU Commission in particular, has a role to play in this, and actually should be at the forefront of bringing together African governments to engage on commercial IFFs, specifically on the tax issue. And this is not something that the AU needs to look at as a project. It is not something that it should be depending on foreign funding, whether it's from GIZ or whoever, EU and all of that, OECD. They have their agenda. And the agenda is not going to be about ending this system, because this system draws resources into the Global North. So the AU needs to put in dedicated resources for this and to collaborate with African governments, with organizations that are working with African governments, ATF and others, TJN and others, Stop the Bleeding campaign. I would also urge that the initiative taken by the AU ministers to call for a UN tax convention is something that needs to be pushed. We were hoping that at the General Assembly, going on currently in New York, there would be a resolution proposed by the AU or by the Africa Group to follow up on that call for a UN tax convention and an intergovernmental tax body located within the UN. It's not yet clear whether that's going to have that resolution is going to be proposed or not. But having said that, there is the sense one gets is that there is a lot of pressure that African governments or Global South governments are undergoing right now. I know in the context of the OECD BEPS deal, there has been significant pressure. That is the understanding, that we have significant pressure on countries like Nigeria and Kenya, which refused to sign up to the deal. There is need to highlight and to put a spotlight on the kind of pressure, and it's often hard to prove, Dereje would know. It's often hard to document it. But there is a need to put a spotlight on those sorts of practices and to have solidarity with countries that make a stand. We have been calling, as ICRIT and other organizations, that African governments must analyze the OECD BEPS deal and understand to what extent their revenues increase under that deal. The analysis that's been done by a number of independent organizations is that most African countries and most global South countries will not have increased revenue under either Pillar 1 or Pillar 2 of the BEPS deal. And indeed, some countries that already have unilateral measures like digital service taxes and others may even have a negative impact in terms of revenue mobilization. So there's a need for this message to come across clearly, including through the AU, but also through civil society, to African governments. Do the analysis, get the data. Let the OECD give you data to show that you're actually going to have increased revenue under it. And the reality is that for most countries in the global south, there is a loss of taxing rights under it because of the priority given to advanced economies. So what can Africa do? The AU must put tax at the center of its agenda. It needs to engage with African stakeholders, governments and civil society as a priority over and against external institutions which will come in with their own agenda, which is really basically supporting the status quo and keeping the OECD BEPS deal as the center of the decisions around taxation. And lastly, I just want to say that there has been some progress over time, over the past 30 years, but we're in a situation where we are certainly seeing significant reversals. Without organizing collectively as Africa and connecting to other global south regions, Latin America and Caribbean and Asia, we will see continued pressure and more reversals in the progress that has already been made around illicit financial flows. And that will continue we'll have a situation where we'll continue to see asymmetries in existing mechanisms for transparency. So you'll have mechanisms for exchange of information and so on, but asymmetries in terms of access for the global south. You will continue to see expansion of the offshore system, with more countries buying into that and opening up secrecy jurisdictions. We'll continue to see multinational corporations expand their markets and their wealth. During COVID, their wealth increased while the majority were driven further into poverty. And we'll continue to see inequality grow with massive impact on our continent and on the global south. So Africa must demand a multilateral solution, pushing the decisions around tax making to the UN. African finance ministers need to work very closely with other agencies of government and with different sectors, trade, foreign affairs, and so on, so that there's a collective unified voice. The AU Commission needs to provide more leadership on this and take its cue from the AU Special Declaration on IFFs rather than external sources in its position and its policy around fighting illicit financial flows. And there has to be more collaboration between official Africa, the governments, and the civil society, which also must work in a collaborative way. It is only through this that we will be able to see a change in the unfair global financial system, with the unfair tax rules and with aggressive tax avoidance, and to remove the hold that the 1% and global corporations in particular have over decision-making in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. And there we go again with a call to collectivize and a call for the African Union to stand up and speak in a unified voice for this continent. Thank you, Irene, for reminding us that these issues, as technical as they may seem, are deeply, deeply political ones. And as a feminist say, the personal is political, and it is an issue for all of us. I'm interested in narratives and the power of narratives. And this narrative that Africa is corrupt and our leaders are inherently incapable of providing for our people is wrong. And the Mbeki panel proved that with only 5% accrued to corruption. And so in my unlearning of narratives, corruption is one. I now try and say the majority world instead of the global south. But also linked to that, Lynn Osome talks about making sure that all our work moves from concrete, real-life issues. We can then theorize and abstract, and then it must always link back to the economy. And that reminded me when you spoke about food being the center of so many of our issues and crises. So thank you. Last but definitely not least, I will be welcoming Mr. Dingani Banda, the Commissioner General for the Zambia Revenue Authority. We're in his country, so very honored to have him on our panel. And as he prepares to come up, I will ask him this. The global tax debate is a complex, seemingly complex affair. Really, it's a powered conversation at the heart of it, with much of the purported revenue allocation not being the expected size, particularly for African countries. Additionally, much has been said about the copper mining in Zambia and whether companies are paying their fair share of tax. So please share with us as the ongoing discussion moves forward, how beneficial it is that extractives have been excluded for the new tax rules. I'll also very sneakily bring in to have you think about this against a backdrop of Zambia being in all our newspapers and news items with the IMF, the recent IMF bailout. So how do you make sure that you're straddling that with, against the IMF bailout, a country so rich in extractives, but even saying that, you know, they have been excluded from the new tax rules? Welcome.
Good morning. I guess it's getting to be afternoon. I must, first of all, thank the organizers to allow me to be here, but I need to make some disclaimers. I'm not Dingan Banda, and I'm not the Commissioner General for Zambia Revenue Authority. So please bear with me, but needless to say, I'm standing in to represent him. I guess my details, I'll try to maybe introduce myself so that we follow through in the conversation we'll have. So my name is Joseph Nonde, and I'm Commissioner in charge of direct taxes. I still work for Zambia Revenue Authority. A while ago, I was at the Ministry of Finance as Director Budget. And since the budget is going to be presented in a few days, if I was at the ministry, unfortunately, I was not going to be here. But I'm at the authority now. So I'll start my intervention by picking on a few things that have been said by the presenters here. A couple of interesting questions were raised about taxation. Who pays the tax? How much of it should be paid? Who shoulders the responsibility? And if you look at those questions, you start thinking, well, we literally looking at how fair is the taxation system. And in dealing with the fairness of the taxation system, you're looking at the ability to pay. Who should pay what? And for me, I take it that for us to come up with a fair tax system, we need to deal with the hemorrhage to the tax base. We need to deal with illicit financial flows, because those are what prevent fairness in the taxation system. Because we need to raise the revenue. And if others are not paying, you move on and try to squeeze as much as you can from those that are easy for you to collect from. And that's where the issue is. So looking at the taxation perspective to the illicit financial flows, we take it that the couple of things that we need to do. And as a country, I know, and as was rightly said, we have a lot of resources that we need to harness for us to raise our own revenues. With so much copper that we have, with so much other mining activities going on, surely we shouldn't be on the begging end of the whip. We need to have our own resources. But then, as the case is, illicit financial flows take away a lot of our ability to collect the revenues that we need. So what are some of the initiatives that we've done as a country? In the mineral resource category, we recognize the fact that there are a lot of trade misinvoicing and under-declaration of exports. And that's something that we need to fight to address. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this is easily said than done. To manage and fight illicit financial flows that relate to natural resource extraction isn't an easy task. But there's something that we feel we need to do, and as a country, we've decided to go the automation way. We've come up with systems that ensure that the ministry that deals with the mining activities, the Ministry of Finance, and Zambia Revenue Authority as an entity that collects the resources work together in a much more automated way. In other words, we're looking at each of the activities that are done by all the responsible entities in the value chain to start working together, to move away the human influence in the process and allow the systems to work on their own, because then the systems will allow for the collection of the correct amount of tax and stop the misinvoicing and under-declaration of the exports that are being done. The other aspect that we're looking at is using data to make appropriate decisions. And again, in this aspect, what we're looking at is ensuring that we come up with a mining data intelligence unit that uses data that is extracted from the systems to decide where the leakages are. So you don't need just depend on the declarations that are made by the mining companies or the mining entities, but instead you look at what the data is saying. If the data is indicating that some of those that are exporting are in the actual fact not paying, or they are engaging in transfer pricing and so forth, you use that data then to know where to focus. And in that way, it helps in trying to address the bigger problem of misinvoicing and under-declaration of exports. The quality of the minerals, again, that are exported is something that we need to address, and that's something that we've been looking at. We feel from our end that if we continue with these initiatives, much more can be achieved in ensuring that we get the resources we need from our mineral endowment that we have as a country. Because if we don't do this, we'll still have a challenge that we've been faced with for a long time. The other aspect that I can talk about is international taxation. We have transfer pricing that is practiced generally, and what we have decided to do is to ensure that we combat the base erosion that come with this. The multinationals that are mainly the investors in our countries normally have to sell these resources outside, and they have a network of subsidiaries in their grouping. So transfer pricing becomes an issue that needs to be addressed thoroughly so that we deal with the anti-avoidance schemes that they come up with. So what we're doing is to come up with this unit that deals with the international taxation issues, particularly to deal with excessive management and royalty charges. Of course, there will always be an argument that multinationals, when they invest in the African continent, and as I've understood now, the global south, the argument is that they need to come with their own skills from wherever they are established. And as they bring in their skilled expertise, there comes with the ability then to charge for those services that they render within the group, and the resources get to be taken away. Obviously, we cannot forget the aspect of thin capitalization as well that has affected us. So as a country, we have the legislation that handles transfer pricing, that handles thin capitalization, that addresses the issues that we need to start attending to for us to ensure that we are up to date. I know that going forward, there's a push to ensure that we have the documentation rules. For those of you that have heard about that in transfer pricing, there's a requirement that we need to start looking at country by country reporting. So of course, there are good things that are coming from the OECD, I must say, regardless of the fact that we feel that they are on the other side of the fence. So these programs that they're coming with are what we're also trying to adopt. And we feel that once we come up with this mechanism of getting the documentation that is needed to do comparative analysis by officers that are dealing with transfer pricing, it will help us to combat financial illicit flows that relate to international transactions. But I know you cannot achieve this alone. You need collaboration with other entities. And at this stage, I must mention that all government entities that are responsible for collection of taxes need to be assisted. And it's good that the civil society voice is becoming stronger. In that way, it sends a message that those that are extracting resources from Africa need to take some responsibility and get some taxes paid where they are getting the resources from. But besides that, we need to be assisted. And the cooperation that we are getting, I think, from the African region, from ETAF, the IGF, and so forth, is something which is commendable, because then it starts allowing all those that are involved in these activities to be upskilled as officers that can manage what is going on. There are a few things that were again asked that are very specific in terms of what is happening. We have the IMF around, we've got the program as a country, so where does this fit in? I think what I understand from what has been given to the public also is the fact that, yes, the IMF program has come, but it's got one condition, that as Zambia, we need to raise our own resources. So domestic revenue mobilization is a conditionality which comes with the IMF program. So even if we have a program, we're not going to fold our hands. We need to focus on raising the revenues. And that's why a lot of these initiatives that we're trying to put in place become very important. Because if we miss it in terms of raising our own revenues, I think at the end of the IMF program, we'll go back to where we were before. We will not have the ability to service our debt, we will not have the ability to provide social services, and all the other things that became difficult for us to do because of being in a debt crisis. So revenue mobilization is something that we can't run away from. And at the core of revenue mobilization, it's tax revenues. And addressing illicit financial flows stops the hemorrhage and protects the revenue base from which you can collect your taxes. So from that angle, it still calls to the fact that the effort that is being put in place to raise revenues, the initiatives that are being put in place to ensure that we continue collecting our revenues still become very important in the environment where we are, regardless of the fact that we have the IMF. A lot more things have been said in terms of probably the fact that, well, we are not getting enough from the mining sector. It's true in the sense that we have a lot of players in there, but probably a few are paying, others are not paying, and so forth. But if you look at the numbers again, you notice that we still get quite some reasonable amounts from the mining sector in terms of taxes. But the question we should be asking is what we are getting now the actual amount that we should get? Is this all that we can get from the resources that we're having? If we can answer that in the affirmative and say yes, then we are okay. But unfortunately, we cannot say that. So we still have a lot of things that need to be done in that space. we need to continue putting in a lot of initiatives to ensure that we get as much as we need to get. So yes, we have the minerals, we have the resources, but a lot more needs to be done in terms of us getting a fair share from the resources that are there. So my take is that we need to continue forming synergies. The assistance that is needed for us to improve resource taxation should not come from those that don't have resources. The initiative should come from within the countries that have the resources. And I ask this question, why can't there be the African Belt solutions for initiatives that deal with resource extraction and revenue mobilization on the basis of the resources that we have? So this challenge is put to ETAF, it's put for all those that are there to assist ensuring that we come up with initiatives that are homegrown, in that we need to start having the synergies within resource-rich countries and determine how best we can adopt the solutions that are working in each of these countries. Because I don't believe that everything some good things that we're doing in ensuring that we get the taxation right on the resources. I know that there are a few things that Botswana is doing, and I know there are others that South Africa is doing, and so are those that are extracting oil and everywhere else. So could we be helped to start identifying the success stories in all these countries? And then we start sharing the information without us waiting for the OECD, without waiting for an institution which is coming from a country that doesn't have resources to come and help us. So in that way, we'll start building initiatives that can work for us. And if it can work for us, we'll know that then we can unlock the resources that are needed to support justice in terms of providing for social services. I think the last thing I need to mention here also is that we feel that while we still need to look at collaboration with other international institutions and other countries, even in-house, there's something that we can do as a country. We need to enhance interinstitutional collaboration by using systems, interfacing of the tax systems to government institutions is something which is very critical. Okay, land is a natural resource that we have as a country, and what are we doing? How can we harness that? Okay, can we interface and start using the systems that will allow us to get the right resources for those that transact in land? And this is something that we're looking at as ZRIA. So we're looking at integrating the systems that we run for taxation with the government institutions, including lands. And once we do that, I feel that a lot more is going to be done. And I'm sure for those of you who have come into this country and are reading, there's a lot of talk in terms of what the investigation wings are doing. And this again is a collaboration which is there. Joint audits, investigations, the tax authority participates in them, Auditor General is into it, and this is what is needed. We need to send a message that there should be a deterrent for those that want not to use resources prudently, because the resources come at a high cost in that they are difficult to get. So these are the few things that I can talk to, but the key thing, like I'm saying, we need to come up with a taxation system which is fair, and fairness demands that we stop the hemorrhage and ensure that we protect the revenue base for the sake of getting the resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and my apologies, Mr. Joseph Nonde, Commissioner for Direct Taxes at the Zambia Revenue Authority. Thank you very much. I am told I am struggling between managing time, and I am standing between you and lunch. But I also would really like to hear from people in this room and outside of this room. And so I have been told there's 2 questions from our online participants. I'm hoping they're registered participants, Brian, because we know how hackers enter our spaces. So Brian, if you could please ask them to raise their hands online, and I think you can actually get them to ask their questions directly. And as Brian does that, because tech sometimes fails us, I will ask people in this room to think of a question that they might want to ask for our panelists. We will take one round of questions just because, or comments, just because I don't have very much time. And I will ask our panelists for any question that's directed to you, please incorporate that into your closing remarks for 2 minutes. Brian, are we ready? 2 minutes, 1 minute? Okay, I will then move to the floor. If I could please have the roving mics. I'll have a question here, in the front. Hey, backbenchers, where are we? One at the back. I will start here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It goes to both Titus and Irene. You talked about solidarity above all for us to resolve everything that we have congregated here for. One voice of African leaders, Africa must step up to lead the IFF struggle. And I think if this should happen, it presupposes we need leaders who are nationalists and Pan-Africanists. So why have we struggled to produce them? Because, I mean, there aren't many of them. That's why when you stand there and you say, Viva so-and-so, Viva so-and-so, you say it unflinchingly without fear of omitting any of them. That's how few they are. And almost all of them have met their death through assassination, except the likes of Amilcar Cabral. And it's not a long ago issue. It happened 2 years ago, even I don't want to say who. Now, please, when you answer this, touch on the issue that Europe has never struggled to produce pan-European leaders. In fact, in the last 15 years, they've gone a step ahead. They are not only producing pan-European leaders, they've produced neo-fascist leaders. Someone very close to me who is studying in Italy just sent me crying faces to tell me I'm effectively living under a neo-fascist government. So what needs to change in Africa for us to go back to the likes of those leaders? Because Europe is producing them without any failure. And they don't need them, we need them.
Do you have a microphone in the front, please? The microphones on the desks are having problems, especially for translation, so we're using the roving mic.
Yep, thank you. Thank you very much. Allow me to take it in French so that maybe we can also give a little work for our colleagues that are in the other booth to say something.
Give us a few minutes to get translation for the panelists. In the meantime...
Okay. Let me take it in English, no problem.
Okay.
We'll do it out of language.
And please introduce yourself.
No, my name is Patrick. I am from the African Union Commission, and as you can see, the speakers here have been, giving a really difficult task to the African Union Commission to deal with this issue of, illicit financial flows and taxation in Africa. I know that there is a second session in which I will be speaking, but I would like to take this opportunity, first of all, to acknowledge the organizers that have, provided the platform for us to discuss this very important topic. Having said that, as it has been highlighted before, Africa stands today at a very difficult situation of its history. So there is need for us to be bold enough to think about what we can do to transform the continent going forward. And I would like to go straight to Irene, because she said something that is important, that we need leadership. But it is not only leadership at the level of the AU, it is leadership also at the level of the society and the civil society. And as you can see today, Alvin, maybe you can witness that there is a shift, a paradigm shift at the AU today, because some few years back we were not able to attend this kind of meetings. But today, the AU is standing with you and working with you. You can see that the collaboration with ATF is reinforcing, and we are strengthening that collaboration to make sure that we are able to address the challenges that we are facing within the continent. I like something that our brother Titus just said. He said, we need to speak one voice, and then we need also to speak the truth. That's what you said, my brother. So, speaking the truth in this meeting today, for me, as I stand as representative of the African Union Commission, will go straight to the point. What is our problem today? Our problem today is that we are strongly relying on others, which is the first ever mistake that we are doing. Look at the history. If you look at the history, in 1945, when the World War II was concluded, Africa and all the other countries that are, transforming today, like China, South Korea, and others, were all poor. And in 1960s, the development perspectives of Africa were even better than the one of China, South Korea, and the others. But how can we be standing at the same level, 50 or 60 years later, and having the same issues? The problem is that we were, and we are still today, relying on others to transform our countries. Let me cite you one sentence that I heard.
I'm giving you half a minute.
I'm wrapping up. 1 second. One sentence that I heard last week coming from a Chinese leader speaking to Americans. What did he say? He said, the US is not in a position, to speak to China from a power position. In 1960s, who could imagine that? But today it is happening, and they are speaking what they want to say. They said they can speak to to China from a power position. So it is true that it is a power problem, because we need to address that. We need to make sure that we strengthen Africa's capacity to speak in a power position. And to do that, we need to transform our continent through what? 1, agriculture, 2, industry, because more has been said in terms of transforming, mineral resources to take advantage of the full potential of what we have. And don't forget, the history is telling lies. Why? Today they are telling you, no, you should not concentrate on your mineral resources to develop. But the issue is that all those countries are turning back to those mineral resources to make sure that they are able to produce the energy that they are not having to transform their economies. So be careful. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one question in the front, and then I have someone in the back, and I'll come.
Okay, yeah, thank you. My name is Nicholas Lekule, and I work with Police Forum. We are based in Tanzania. And thanks to the panelists for the discussions that we have had so far. I was basically interested with the fact that we are not looking at just revenue, but how is the revenue being generated? Who pays the revenue? And looking back at what is happening in my home country, that is Tanzania, we have had issues with the spending of what is being generated. So I think as we put an emphasis on how we raise the revenue, I think the same level of emphasis has to be put on how our leaders are spending the raised revenue, because we have had cases whereby the government has been introducing new levies every now and then. And we have had a case whereby one of the multinational companies has been granted an exemption of over 150 billion USD, which is quite a significant amount. And what we are seeing is that the government is mostly concerned with levies because they are easy to collect, you see. So I think as we are talking of leadership, heads of state to provide leadership, we would also want to see them providing leadership in terms of how best they can use the revenues that have been generated. Thank you.
Thank you. Mukasiri, do we have questions from our online participants?
Okay, thanks. Joel, I'm muting you. Please proceed to speak.
Mobilizing domestic resource, domestic resources in Africa. Just to say that our government also have their role to play in ensuring justice and transparency in how we're ensuring that we're mobilizing domestic resources. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself. I'm Gramende. I work with NON. I'm based in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, in 2019, when the tax expenditure statement was released, we saw that the country was losing a significant amount of money to tax expenditure, tax waivers that they are giving to sectors. So it would be good if government can ensure transparency, frequently, regularly reporting on how much we are letting go through tax waivers. Have those policies been effective? If they know, then we should be accountable in saying that, okay, policies that we're implementing, because they are not bringing us any addition. And the Parliament also has a role to play. And also, it also fits into the discussion on tax justice. So if we are giving out tax waivers haphazardly, then other people who also feel that they're working don't necessarily have the morale to continue to pay taxes. So that's the one. And the other bit is on, I'm not sure if it has been covered, but on curbing illicit financial flows. I know the OECD last year had rolled out this two-pillar solution to address illicit financial flows, and I know a number of African countries have signed on to it. So I would like to know if we think this is a good solution that is suitable for Africa. If not, what are African countries doing to ensure that their voices are heard in terms of, this policy or this solution is not suitable for us? How are we making our voices heard to ensure that solutions that are tailor-fit for us are being?
Thank you. Mukasiri, do we have one more?
Yes,
I'm going to ask to please keep it brief. So if you could, I'm a geriatric millennial and my play is on Twitter. So if you could keep it brief, I'm going to ask you to keep it within like a tweet in your question so that we can have more people have space.
Right. We have a comment from Maria Ron. Thank you, Irene. Indeed, illicit financial flows are part of a continuing neo-colonial plunder. The Africa Union Ministers of Finance call for a UN tax convention seem to have been positively picked by the United Nations Secretary General. What's happening? Sorry, my laptop is ticking. But we can give the opportunity now to Geoffrey to contribute. Please go on.
And Geoffrey, please remember to keep it short.
Right. My name is Geoffrey Kasi. I'm from Ghana. It is Director for Revenue Mobilization Africa. My little input is that I think African governments have not really shown enough commitment to fighting illicit financial flows. It is worrying that every time we talk about illicit financial flows, the governments and the African Union will shift our focus to concentrate on other countries and people out of our country. We have the resources here. They come into our country. We are the host country. We should put mechanisms in place so that people do not come and take advantage of us. Blame people every day. They're sick and tired of that. Put systems in place. They come into your country. Ensure you put systems in place so that the phantom money do not leave your country. Solve our problems. We give you the positions of governments to solve our problems. Stop blaming other people. Solve our problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. We have a question in the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Lusungu Kacheche, and my question is going to Titus. You rightly said that as African countries, when we are going into the debates or on the negotiating table around economic recovery post-COVID-19, we should be going with a justice lens and demanding for economic justice. I just wanted you to share with us from your perspective the opportunities that are there and how we can take advantage of them. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got one in the second row.
Thank you so much. I'm Jessica Koopman. I really like what Crystal said, as well as Irene, regarding women. I think also Titus said, the multiple intersecting crises really do fall on the backs of black women in the global south. But I didn't see us really going into the conversation on how do we move forward, how do we center black women. And then Irene was also speaking about, there's time for doing and there's time for thinking. And Mam Kani was saying there's a lack of Pan-African leaders, but I want to go a step further and say that there's a lack of black leaders that are also pushing for the centering of women, pushing for a black feminist agenda. So how do we do that? Because when we look at these multiple intersecting crises of conflict, COVID, climate change, it is women who are mostly affected. And it's also women who are migrating to the global north, for example, to work as caregivers. And they are the people also bolstering their home economies. So you have this double whammy of women doing so much locally and abroad. And it's not always just for their social reproductive activities in the home, but it's also carrying the economies on their backs. So why aren't we centering this conversation around inclusive recovery on how do we ease the load of black women? As Crystal said, she's also tired of being a strong black woman. So how do we move forward? How do we say that, this extractivist agenda that we are pushing is capitalist, patriarchal in nature, and that is not who we are as Africans. Mam Kani will tell you. So I think that when we are speaking about inclusive recovery, speaking about crises, we should start with what can we do to make sure that our children's children aren't carrying the load that we and our parents before us and all of that has gone through. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Cecilia Matia, National Advocacy Coalition Extractives in Sierra Leone. Thanks to the speakers, I think we are sovereign states in Africa. We have forgotten that we have not looked at our constitutions and our laws. I think all of what we are saying, the investors come. One thing they remind us is that, but this is not in your law. This is not in your constitution. So what have we done? If we are talking about domestic revenues and other things, let's start looking at the very constitution that makes us a sovereign state of the land. AU would come in, but they can't come to overstep what is in our laws. All other governments will come. As long as you have our laws and policies, they can't step in to dictate. It depends on what you have, and then they conform to it. For example, like the mines, like the minerals law, when they come in, what is in your law? They have very good lawyers. On the continent, do we have negotiating body that goes to negotiate for us? No. It's from the World Bank, African Development Bank, and others. When are we starting to have our own people sit, like in West Africa, as a negotiating team? When there is negotiations here, they go there, and then they do it on our behalf, not on our behalf. And so until we decide that we reform our laws, we can't. When our government came in, we said, for elections, because we'll be having problems, politicians always want to set the agenda. What civil society said, from the mining sector, can we have 5 years to election, each year get an ESCO account to keep money in it, so that by the 5th year, the country has money to run its own elections. I can bet you no donor has come to put in a dime, but we are running on it. These are the sort of reforms we start looking at, and as you said, let's collaborate and work together, and then we dictate our pace.
Thank you. There's a question at the back, if I can have a microphone. Second row from the back.
Thank you, Crystal. My name is Ren Flortamo. I'm coming from Cameroon, and I identify myself as a tax justice champion. But I'm going to speak now in French because I'm very.
Give us a minute. We don't
Yes.
have translation for the front, so I'm going to give Dereje the microphone for a question. I'll ask you to hold as we get translation for the panelists, and I'll come right back to
Okay,
you.
I'm waiting.
Francis, if we can get translation for the front.
Thank you. Thank you for Charles, Irene, and the other speakers to remind us about interconnectedness of the problem. Most of us are engaged in one-issue movements. We fundraise for that, we do advocacy for that, so we tend to forget sometimes that these things are interconnected. Coming back to what Charles was saying at the beginning, I can't see you now. Anyway, there is this problem. For those of us who are older, the whole situation now reminds, it looks like a deja vu. Beginning of 1980s, there was debt crisis. Africa had a solution, Lagos Plan of Action, the IMF came, and we are put under structure adjustment programs. Again, Africa said no to structural adjustment programs and say yes to structural economic transformation. So my question now is, the crisis has gone deeper. The solutions which are now being pushed upon our countries are those which threw back and annihilated all the progress, post-independence progress in the 1980s, 1970s and 1980s. Again, we are back to that. The whole austerity programs are in the preparation. So I ask this question because maybe because of generation gap, I don't see African countries receiving this panacea as if they were not worse than the disease itself when they came in the 80s. Now being received as a new issue, as new solutions. And maybe also within our ranks, the younger generations might not have seen what structural adjustment brought on Africa. My fear is the new edition of structural adjustment is going to kill us more. It will be severe and worse than the current crisis itself. So what do we do now to warn the African youth, African governments if possible, and the whole African civil society that what is in the making to give as a recipe for us to solve the crisis is going to be worse than the crisis, worse than what we saw during the structural adjustment programs in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dereje. We're going to do a hybrid translation, so I'll ask the microphone to go to her again, and we have the translators, hopefully with a microphone that can translate in real time. May I have a microphone? Oh, you have one. Okay.
Merci Crystal. Je m'adresse à Monsieur Joseph Nondé. J'ai bien écouté sa présentation et l'évocation de la réglementation sur les prix de transfert ont attiré mon attention. Et je voulais juste poser une question, celle de savoir si à travers la réglementation des prix de transfert, les États ne peuvent pas, à partir de là, collecter plus d'impôts, dans le sens que ne pouvant pas empêcher ces flux financiers entre les multinationales dans le monde, qu'au niveau des transferts faits sur un territoire, que l'impôt qui frappe...
You need to give him time to translate.
Okay.
May we please have the translation?
No, we are doing it simultaneously. I'm doing it simultaneously, yes. It's
Okay.
going on simultaneously,
No,
yes.
It's only for the panelists.
Yes, yes. Yes, I'm doing it actually simultaneously.
Can we get a microphone in there so that the panelists hear the question?
No, we are waiting. Nobody is speaking.
We can't continue because the panelists need to hear what the question is.
She can continue. She may continue.
Okay.
We are using two microphones.
If the translation booth can hear me, we can't continue because the panelists need to hear the question too. So if we can give you a microphone to translate on a microphone.
Yes,
no.
but she has stopped
Okay.
talking.
They
Let her
don't
talk,
have
and then
that.
we can continue.
Okay, I'll ask you to finish your question. If you could keep it short, and we'll find a way to translate for the panelists.
Peut-être que je pouvais traduire d'abord ma question et peut-être la faire lire en anglais. Peut-être c'est mieux ainsi. Maybe I can translate my question in English and read it after.
That would be helpful. As you can see, I'm also blank.
Thank you. It's better that. I need to write it. I cannot speak.
Okay, she will write it, and we'll give the translation booth or somebody to read it out. We're really sorry about that, but I think the translation booth got your question, and we will translate it for the panelists.
Put it in writing.
So I'm also juggling time, and sorry I couldn't take all the questions. I'm being kicked off the platform. Omar, I see you. But there's coffee break, there's lunch breaks, and that's really where the magic happens with these conferences. So please have conversations. I'll start at my extreme left and ask you to come up, please, Commissioner, and please give us your final remarks. And if there's any questions that were directed at you, you can include them in your final remarks. And I'm going to ask you to please give them in about 2.5 to 3 minutes.
Thank you. I wish I could hear the question in French. I could only pick my name. The rest of the things I didn't. I'm so sorry. But then we can engage, and probably I can make my intervention. So briefly, my take from the questions that are being raised, yes, it borders on the fact that we need to have our own solutions. The big man here mentions he's seen this before, and the IMF and the initiatives and the fears that it will be worse. Okay, and well, one thing which is coming is the fact that we need to focus on revenue mobilization. We need to have our own resources that we need to raise, and if we look outside, we can only get a bit of it and not what we need. So if we are to get the resources that we need, I take it that we need a lot more of continued pressure and advocacy. That will be very important. Okay, and even as we engage, we need to understand that the solutions that are being offered, particularly by the OECD, it's an advanced solution. Okay, if we take time to continue thinking and planning of what we're going to do, the solution will come forward. When I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the BEPS solution, the two-pillar solution. I take it that as an inclusive framework continues to engage, there are a lot of questions that we need to raise ourselves as people from Africa, but the solution and the mechanism of coming up with a solution keeps moving forward. So we need to have the voice that can put across what we need. Okay, if we don't do that, it will become a reactive mechanism on our part, and that is not going to help us. So for those that are on the panel and are given an opportunity to speak on the inclusive framework, I think they need to do so with the understanding of the concerns that everyone else is raising. Now, if the OECD can have a global solution, why can't the global South have a global solution? That's the question I ask, and that's the last remark I have to make. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is just the beginning of the discussion. I think in the next couple of days, or next day and a half, there'll be more discussion. Just very quickly on the BEPS thing, and I won't go into details because of time. The challenge, and there's analysis on this, and it's really important for African governments to look at the analysis, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the governments, who sign up or not sign up. But the analysis shows very clearly that Pillar 1 will generate very little revenue, maybe just additional 1% revenue from global corporations. And Pillar 2 may produce more revenues, but priority will be given to advanced economies in the application of those new revenues. So they will have the first rights over the revenues. And countries that do not host headquarters of multinational corporations can only come in to tax under tax profits if another jurisdiction which has prior right to tax does not do it. Not likely to happen. So the analysis is that 60% of the revenues under that will likely go to advanced economies. So there'll be very little domestic resource mobilization to Africa and other developing countries. But there is analysis available on that, to break it down. And what we've been calling to African governments is to ask the OECD to give the data. Give the data that shows exactly how much revenue countries are going to get under Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So it's not based on general principles, but factually, what are you going to get out of it? Because ultimately, what Africa and developing countries were needed out of it was increased allocation of taxing rights and increased revenues. And it looks like it's lost on both of those. So I'm just coming very quickly to the questions that were put to me, my sister, and others. There's no magic bullet. We know that. We're talking about entrenched interests and benefiting from a status quo. So the fight against that, we said it's political, it's a process. But that process has to start with clarity. And so for that clarity, I would say information. So information sharing. I've talked about the government position, for example, with BEPS, information sharing within civil society, and building of coalitions. The question is, how do you build power? How do you build power? We need to look at the strengths that we have and see how do we harness that. And it's a process, and we need to have a discussion about how do we go around the process. Now, in terms of that process and the point raised by Dereje, I think we need to have a new approach where we look at things from a historical perspective. We need to, for economists, instead of looking at the situation as it is now, what does economic history show us? So this fight, for example, for tax justice started way back, as you know, in the UN, the G77 and so on. What were the forces that pushed against it? What were the strengths they had? On what basis did we lose the fight then in the 70s and the 80s, for example? And what do we learn from that? So we need to learn from the history of these processes and to move forward from that. The solution is around organizing. I mean, there's no two ways around it. It really is around organizing, around collective interests, so understanding what the collective interests are. And I think framing of it, for me, I think we need to be very clear. Global South is the main loser under the status quo, but ultimately, the 99% are in the Global South and the Global North. So how do we strengthen the building of global coalitions focused on Global South, but also bringing in Global North? Because majority of our citizens in Global North are losing from this. They don't understand it. It's their governments and their corporates, their elites, who are benefiting from the status quo. So building those, and there are processes that have happened in the past. I recall 2002, 2005, some of the fights that we had around the WTO, and how we were able to, I was a parliamentarian then, how working as parliamentarians with civil society and governments, the trade sector, we were able to cause a collapse of the ministerial in Cancun. So it is possible. It is possible, but it's a process, and one has to be organized in order to achieve it. Lastly, we do have some technical spaces in Africa. I think the commissioner talked about, or somebody raised it. Where do we have capacity build and so on, and for negotiations? So I know African Legal Support Facility does give support to African governments on negotiations. So there are some spaces like that. Maybe a mapping of the existing technical support spaces, ATF and others, for governments, so that you also know where the resources are that can support you in technically. And last two things, I think I saw as a politician that one of the challenges for leaders is there's too little space for actual brainstorming. Too many of the meetings are protocol and things like that, you know, without really going down to the deep issues and understanding the deep issues and taking a collective position. There isn't enough space for that, whether we're talking about presidents or ministers or whatever it is. So organizing spaces that enable leaders to reflect and come to a common position as Africans, you know, as Pan-Africans, even for parliamentarians. We had to do that when I was in IALA. We had to organize at the beginning of IALA, together with civil society, some spaces for reflection of the IALA, and that helped us to be much more political and strategic in our work for the next 5 years. So doing a lot more of that sort of thing is important. And for Africa, AU, I think when I look at what's going on with the tax issue, there are some opportunities, but there are also those standing on the sideline waiting to push and close off those opportunities. How can you borrow from what's happening in trade? You know, with the Africa trade negotiations, there's a lot more organizing that's happened around that. The Geneva group, they're quite organized. How do we borrow from that and bring that into the tax space? So that you have your Paris ambassadors, your Addis ambassadors, your New York ambassadors, organizing the way the trade ambassadors do in Geneva. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, some of which is being done in the trade arena. How do you borrow from that and connect? I'm currently based in New York, and I see the lack of the link, you know, between what happens in New York, what happens with Addis, and what happens with Paris on the OECD thing. How do you strengthen that connection? And how do you strengthen between the tax people, trade people, and foreign affairs? Because when it comes to external engagement, it's going to be your foreign ministries. Connect those sectors so that you have the trade and tax people giving them the technical stuff, and they're the ones going to be in the continuous forums where these discussions of this sort are happening. And lastly, we need a blueprint, common African position for development. What's our common African position for development that we then apply to trade, to tax, to agriculture, to food, whatever it is? This is our blueprint, and what we're negotiating, whether it's an OECD or wherever it is, that's the blueprint that we follow. I think the West has theirs. It's time that we organize our own that guides us in every space that we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. I will ask the Commissioner to come up again. We had technical problems with the French question. I think everybody in the audience heard it, but we had it translated for him.
Thank you. I think I've got the question now. Basically, she wants to find out whether to deal with the challenges that come with the transfer pricing, we can't raise taxes or the tax rates so that we get more revenues in that sphere. And I start responding by indicating that to increase taxes is a sovereign right that each state has. It's very possible to raise taxes. You determine the taxes, that's where your sovereignty comes as a state. But then the question is, if you raise the taxes, what will be the impact on the investment that you have? Okay. How are you going to compete in the very competitive global market? So those are the things that you need to take into account as you look at the raising of taxes. And besides that, one would want to argue that probably multinationals also tend to arm twist by indicating that they'll slow down on investment. And it shows if they are not investing, eventually your resource will remain lying there without being exploited, and you not get the resources that you need to get. So everyone else in international taxation feel that you need to address the transfer pricing issues, but transfer pricing in itself is a complex exercise. You need to do a lot of activities that it comes with for you to decipher and come up with a position that you can defend and make the adjustments. So as a country, probably in Zambia, we've tried both ways. At one time, we increased taxes on the mining sector. We had an outcry, government got resources, but eventually it can't be sustained. They need to start investing. So we're making an adjustment to the taxes so that we can allow the mining companies to invest. But while they continue doing that, we need to focus more on strengthening our position on transfer pricing and make the adjustments. They don't come easily, they plan as they come with a team, a transfer pricing expert, international expertise. That's what all the multinationals have. That resource is not available for any country, it becomes very difficult. But when you collaborate, get the synergies, seek help from others, like in this country, we're not doing it on our own. We have GIZ helping us in the same space, we have ETAF helping us, they are sending experts to build the team, so that that team can then stand up and defend the transfer pricing adjustments that they are making. So we do something which is acceptable everywhere else, but we do it better in a way that allows us to get something in terms of stopping transfer pricing. But remember one thing, wherever there are international transactions, transfer pricing is normal. Whenever you are transacting with your related parties, you always do that. The question is it the correct price that you are putting? Is it at arm's length? And once you make the adjustments, then you can get the resources. I feel transfer pricing adjustment is far much better than just raising taxes. Because if you raise the taxes, it will still cause a lot more other problems with your investment, to the extent that they'll be threatening to pull out. And I think there's no African country which has the capability to say, okay, go leave my resources, we'll stay hungry, we'll not provide social services. We always think we need the resource to support social services and everything else. I hope that helped. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll ask Titus to come up.
I totally lost track of the questions. Maybe I could just add the question on tax incentives. There is almost a fetish, I think, in our governments around tax incentives, you know. And I think it's also a product of doing business, doing, you know, that World Bank, you know, what did we call it? It's been discredited. Now we know a lot of it was a bit of a farce. There are many reasons why investors choose to invest in a country, and it's usually not always tax incentives. I mean, that's why they are in a country with war, with no roads, 20% literacy. They will still pour 10 billion in there. But then you are told a country as solid as Ghana that nobody is coming unless you remove tax incentives. I think there are it's a lot more complicated, and it's not as simple as that. And in some ways, we try to achieve with tax incentives what we are failing with basic peace in the country, decent roads, human capital. If you do that, I assure you, many countries are making a lot of money with very high tax rates because they've done the other pieces of work that they've done. If you've got the resource, you've got the other factors, usually tax incentives are not your issue. Anyway, just I thought I could add that. Lastly, maybe I'll try to combine the question around the Lagos Plan of Action and leadership at Marl, because I think it's actually a good way to illustrate the leadership issue and what I think is the solution. The Lagos Plan of Action and the Berg report are products of our leaders, in a way, but they reflect the contest of ideas between African leaders and international partners at the stage. And to me, the key thing that we learn, and I mean, some of you may have had the key debate between, was it Paul Tembezeleza and Mukandawire at some point around comparing Lagos Plan of Action and the Berg report, that it tells you that we run governments that are at war with themselves in terms of ideas. We are in one government, but we believe different things. You could sit in the same government or in the same cabinet, but you come from different intellectual traditions. And we underestimate that just because we are all Africans. You will be shocked the positions of some people in here on the role of the state, the role of women, the role of the K economy. We don't believe the same things. And so a critical issue in leadership development is probably what they call the development of the Afrocrat. That the project of the European Union needed the development of the Eurocrat. A Eurocrat is someone ideologically and intellectually committed to the project of EU or intellectual regional integration. Part of the challenge within our governments is we've got well-connected political elites who went to Harvard, some went to Russia, some went to University of Nairobi. You sit in President Ruto's government and you don't believe in the same thing. So perhaps you need a process, which is what Alvin is trying to do, in intellectually developing a common Africa position on IFF so that we believe the same things. One day we are appointed, we can actually operate like we believe one thing. Civil society, we don't believe the same thing, comrades. Whereas within our government. So maybe AU could help us create a space where you cannot work in an African government or AU agency unless you have gone through some kind of basic intellectual training beyond your Harvards and Nairobis and what. We go through the same where we believe one thing. For me, that's how we develop leadership, Admiral. And of course, when we see the leaders, the guys in private sector, in markets, in civil society, let's affirm them, let's protect them, let's appreciate them, let's connect them. There is not enough connection beyond our domains. Civil society, we are among civil society friends. I think the reformers, the Afrocrats in private sector, Afrocrats in education, in government, in civil society, have to find a way of connecting and engaging around the project of African liberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Titus. Charles.
I think it would be interesting, again, following up on the AU, the opportunities to have the intellectual discussion about policy options. So the point about taxation and extraction. Just to make the point that ideas, because we work across the South, we're doing a comparative study of resource management, including taxation, resource rent sharing in Latin America, and resource management, resource rent sharing, and their impact on financial flows in Africa. So maybe when we advance now, I'll be happy to share and have that kind of discussion. I just wanted to follow up on the young woman's big question: how do we, recover from COVID and everything else, from an economic justice perspective? That was the question, right? It links up with a point Dereje made about the now, the dangers of adjustment now. So let me just make this point. We are clearly moving into a next era of adjustment. And I fear that for the next decade, we will be caught up with adjustment in a situation that is far worse than the 1980s. It's far worse because in the 1980s, the Americans and the West had won the ideological battle, right? Right now, it's in the middle of a hot contestation where the space to maneuver is exceedingly narrow. Therefore, here are my take about creating any space at all for an adjustment with an economic justice perspective. Let's start global. 3 things without which there is no space other than extreme austerity, which we will all go through. We have to drop the debt, including private debt. We have to reallocate SDRs from rich countries who are not using it to poor countries who are using it. Thirdly, we have to take the reparations discussion seriously, including connect that to climate change. With our climate financing, which is cheap money, there's almost no space for adjustment. On the financing things, these are 3 things for me. On the domestic things, the following are 4. Governments must learn to move away from dependence and their appetite for external foreign exchange denominated debt. They can do better borrowing domestically. They must move away from an appetite for bonds, external bonds, to domestic bonds. They must, within the next 5 to 10 years, reduce the percentage of external foreign denominated debt in their debt portfolio. It's the only way to make the restriction of debt, which is from your own people domestically, an issue of economic transformation. That's the first one. Secondly, it will then avoid what Ghana is doing, which is basically securitize your natural resources to raise bonds. And they are not only securitizing natural resources, they're also securitizing pension funds, education funds, health insurance funds to raise bonds. And therefore, for the next 10 years, those flows of resources are blocked in order to change them into foreign exchange, which you are finding difficult to even raise that foreign exchange in order to pay for the debt. It has to stop. The third thing is we must prioritize feeding ourselves at all cost. This is absolutely critical because the future is in our ability to survive, and that's food. My third point is, in all of this, transformational social policy should be at the center. The final point which Irene made, civil society must organize together with progressive governments that are prepared to stick their neck out. We have forgotten to celebrate Mangafuli. We have forgotten to celebrate Mele Zenawi. We must not do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. That was a literal mic drop. Thank you very much to our panelists, our audience, both online and here in person. This was such a titillating conversation, one that has began, what will be 2 days of real world making as we go forward into the different discussions. And as Titus spoke, a friend of mine asked me the other day, how much of your profile is left after you subtract white institutions that have validated your practice? And I leave you with that question, and I wonder what our African Union and government leaders have to say if we ask them the same question. I will now hand over back to Francis. It has been an honor and a privilege to moderate this very interesting, inspirational panel, so thank you very much. I wish you a happy lunch and a happy 2 days.
Yeah, I think Christo as well deserves a big clap for standing the pressure from both the crowd, the moderator, myself, the questions you were posing, and you all did well. Nobody slept. So give yourself a clap. We will break for lunch now. We come back at 2 p.m. And lunch will be served right when you walk outside where we had our tea break. You keep going down all the way to the end. There are tables arranged, and that's where we will have our lunch. As you walk out, kindly remember to get your vouchers so that you can also get a drink when you go for lunch. I'm being reminded that we need to tweet as much as you can. Tweet the photos you're taking with your friends. Tweet your ideas. Tweet your questions. Let's create a media bliss out there. And lastly, now that we have spoken about the School of Afrocrats, I don't know whether we should consider giving you certificates after the pack this time, because you will have qualified in the first step of becoming Afrocrats. So should TJNA give you certificates? Not yet. You still need more schooling, eh? Okay. And lastly, because Charles Senior here has said we need to feed ourselves at all costs, I'm inviting you to lunch. See you back at 2 p.m.